Thank you for the kind introduction. My topic is cultural diplomacy in a world of conflict. And I will try to explain briefly the dilemmata and also contradictions under which cultural diplomacy is being practiced in our time. I'll begin with a quote from an official text. Since wars begin in the minds of men, it is in the minds of men that the defenses of peace must be constructed. This is how UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, defines its mission in the first sentence of its constitution, which was adopted after the end of the Second World War. And this is, I add, how the role of culture must be seen in the context of worldwide tension and conflict today. In our era of global interconnectedness and interdependence, issues of culture and cultural identity have indeed become of crucial importance for peace, irrespective, I would say, of whether we subscribe to Samuel Huntington's earlier diagnosis or not. In order to understand and properly evaluate the meaning of cultural diplomacy, I shall briefly reflect on the nature of culture in the context of politics, and in particular in the context of international relations. As the most comprehensive framework of reference for a community's self-realization in a unique Lebenswelt, life world, if I may borrow from the philosopher Edmund Husserl's phenomenology. As this most comprehensive framework, culture, through all of history, has proven its resilience vis-à-vis political power, even in the form of military force. And this is a theme the gentleman from Turkey has also been referring to. The ancient Greek worldview, expressed in philosophy, science, and arts, shaped cultural identity in the powerful Roman Empire that conquered the Greek city-states. Another example, Arab Islamic culture, to give just that one more additional proof, was able to survive under the Mongol Empire, where each of the successor states adopted the dominant local religion. A point, by the way, particularly stressed by US Chinese scholar Amy Chua in her far-reaching analysis of the importance of cultural inclusiveness and tolerance for the building of empires. Culture rooted in religion has proven particularly resilient vis-à-vis political power, as has been evident in the eventual fate of Marxism-Leninism in the former Soviet Empire, including, I would say, in occupied Afghanistan, of Western-inspired modernism under the Shah of Iran, or of a dogmatic version of secularism in the Turkish Republic. I cannot go into more details here because of the limits of time. In world history, culture has indeed shaped politics. In the other direction, the influence was often much less successful, and certainly it was less sustainable. Even as regards the history of colonialism, the verdict is still out. Where the conqueror did not or was not able to eliminate the native population, the invader's culture was often simply superimposed over indigenous traditions that in turn redefined and reshaped the dominant culture. This is also evident in the practice of the Christian faith under African or South American traditions. The relationship between culture and empire is certainly more complex than the advocates of cultural supremacy have been willing to admit through the centuries. And it is definitely not unidirectional. Unlike culture, or as its most general impression, civilization, politics is not necessarily a comprehensive phenomenon driven by the human desire to understand and interpret the world as such and defining man's position in it. In the real, not to be confused with the ideal world, relations between political entities have always been a competition for power, motivated by the pursuit of what is called the national interest. It is a historical reality that those interests, always oriented towards the good life of the nation, so to speak, now the slogan is "My country first." These interests have all too often been asserted in the course of war. In all such situations, issues of culture and cultural identity have been subordinated to political considerations. Culture has often been instrumentalized for the purposes of legitimation of wars, as is again the case in our time. In this era of a global war on terror, as it is called, the international use of force in the service of national interests is justified, or is often justified, as a defense of civilization against its enemies. However, if war is the continuation of politics by other means, as the German theoretician von Clausewitz famously said in the 19th century, one may ask the question whether cultural diplomacy that belongs also to the realm of politics can help to prevent or curb conflict, or at least contribute to a negotiated settlement. In the political context, and even more so in international relations, we must be aware of the dual use, I repeat, dual use aspect of culture, if I may borrow for a moment from modern arms control terminology. Especially in situations of armed confrontation, culture, as I said, can be an element of indoctrination as well as of education, while the former, indoctrination, means the instrumentalization of cultural identity in the service of war propaganda. The latter, education, relates to information that may help to expose stereotypes and overcome prejudice. Regrettably, at the beginning of the 21st century, the former aspect appears to have become the dominant one. Many of the looming confrontations and ongoing conflicts are portrayed in the framework of a so-called clash of civilizations, namely a vicious cycle of cultural stereotyping and use of force. This has been particularly the case with so-called humanitarian interventions that have become a typical feature of post-Cold War power politics and have been part of a wider strategic agenda of regime change. And also this has already been referred to by previous speakers, with devastating consequences, as Dr. Babuna also told us, for peace and stability far beyond the affected regions. The instrumentalization of notions such as democracy, human rights, rule of law, for essentially political purposes has not only discredited those values and ideals, but has become a major obstacle to a stable and peaceful world order. Cultural exclusivism, namely the insistence on one's own world view and value system as being the universal, the paradigmatic one, this kind of exclusivism has provoked perpetual resistance and produced counter-narratives from other cultural communities. How can, I would ask, in such a confrontational scenario, issues of culture and cultural identity play again a constructive role? What is needed, in my assessment, is a grand design of cultural diplomacy that must be shaped by the recognition of mutuality. That means an understanding that cultural cooperation is essentially a two-way project, and that is aware of the integral aspect of culture, which may be described by a notion I have used in the early 1970s, by the notion of the dialectics of cultural self-comprehension. What do I mean by that? Culture can never flourish in an insular, abstract realm. Accordingly, it must be propagated in a dialogical manner. Thus, cultural foreign policy as such is not compatible with an imperialist agenda, not to speak of an agenda of war, whether it's called humanitarian intervention or by any other term. Culture is not a mere corollary of politics, but it is a defining element of it. Only if politicians realize that there is no supremacy of politics over culture is there space for meaningful and effective cultural diplomacy. And it is here, I think, where the role of UNESCO must be acknowledged. At the present juncture of world affairs, the crucial question for cultural diplomacy will be whether it will evade the trap of the clash of civilizations. If there is to be a real chance for cultural diplomacy to have an impact on international developments under the adverse circumstances of today's many conflicts, it must be more than a mere decoration of regular diplomatic business. The goal of cultural diplomacy as part of a state's conduct of foreign affairs must be an honest and integral sharing of a nation's life world with other nations, comprising its distinct value system with all forms of art and lifestyle, and not only bilaterally between one state and another, but also multilaterally. Only this is in accordance with UNESCO's philosophical vision of overcoming, and I quote from the UNESCO Constitution, of overcoming ignorance of each other's ways of and lives, that, in the words of the UNESCO Constitution, throughout history has nurtured, and I quote again, suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world, through which their differences have all too often broken into war, end quote. Thus, the approach must be inclusive and based not only on national self-assertion and pride, but also on what I call cultural curiosity at the same time. Ideally, the pursuit of cultural diplomacy in the global context should be an element of what the United Nations Organization, following the proposal of President Mohammad Khatami of Iran, has propagated as dialogue of civilizations. Instead of fueling aggressive attitudes that may lead to war, as has so often been the case in history, culture must be asserted and thus developed in a context of cooperation and mutual exploration of reality by all nations. In its true, namely inclusive sense, culture is always a joint project of mankind, namely a realization of our common life world that is based on the very universality of the mind. However, if we follow this philosophical ideal, serious credibility issues arise for cultural diplomacy under conditions of realpolitik. I use here the German word Realpolitik, which is already part of English terminology. To stress it yet again, as a matter of principle, culture must not exclusively be used as a political tool or an instrument of power politics, as tempting as this may be for countries with global ambitions and global responsibilities as they see them. The integrity of cultural diplomacy depends on the honesty of the message that is not to be tainted by second thoughts. An instrumental or functionalist approach is not only incompatible with culture as such, but also politically counterproductive. To give just one admittedly drastic example, if culture is brought on the bayonets of an invader, this will not only discredit the invader's self-proclaimed mission, but do more harm than good, even according to that country's strategic calculations. In such cases, the reassertion of identity on the part of the subjugated people will be much stronger, and the long-term prospects of stability in the concerned region will be much dimmer. The events in the wider Middle East since the beginning of the new century and the chain reaction of cultural alienation and destabilization in other parts of the world triggered by those events are a case in point. As a result of these developments, a credibility or consistency issue has also evolved in terms of the crisis of what we today call the multicultural society. International conflicts, often followed by civil wars, such as those in the Middle East, have further exacerbated tensions between cultural and religious communities in other parts of the world, and also here in this part of the world, in Europe, including in my country, in Austria. In the era of globalization, the challenges have become almost insurmountable, especially as relations between Islam and the non-Muslim world are concerned. And here I ask, how can countries where bias against another culture or religion has entered the social and political mainstream and has begun to shape those countries' domestic and international policies, how can such countries credibly assert their national identity vis-à-vis the rest of the world? Or, to say it more bluntly, how can cultural diplomacy be practiced in an atmosphere of hatred and prejudice, where the exploitation of stereotypes has become part of the political game? And I mean by this part of party politics and electoral campaigns. And we do not need to look very far here in Europe to give examples. The credibility problem exists on all sides of the cultural divide. How can countries successfully market their culture, including their language, poetry, arts, and sports, in a constellation where mutual incriminations in reference to cultural and, in particular, nowadays, religious issues characterize the day-to-day interaction between those countries? One example now would be the relations between the Republic of Turkey and some countries here in Europe, and in particular my own. In more general terms, how can a country be credible internationally as a messenger of culture that domestically antagonizes or oppresses other cultures? It is important here to stress also, just to avoid a misunderstanding, I would say, so one should stress that the notion of leading culture, I mean here the German term Leitkultur or guiding culture, must not be interpreted in the sense of a dogmatic value statement, because this would exclude dialogue or coexistence between cultures at the international level. Globally, we must accept the principle of equality and mutuality. In conclusion, against all these challenges in today's conflict-ridden global environment, cultural diplomacy may play a constructive, even a crucial role when and if the protagonists avoid the Machiavellian temptation to use culture and issues of cultural identity as a political tool. In situations of tension and conflict, violent measures, except of course in cases of self-defense, are not necessarily the most efficient ones, just to stress that point once again. Not to speak of the illegality of such violent measures under modern international law, because under modern law there is not anymore the right to wage war. What is important in such circumstances is a creative and non-dogmatic approach, which I would say is the quintessence of diplomacy. This is exactly, in my assessment, the advantage of culture, because it appeals to the universal nature of the human being, unlike politics that is unavoidably the management of group interests and group egoism, conventionally and quasi-officially described as the national interest. If understood in the integrative and comprehensive sense which I have described here, cultural diplomacy may serve indeed a constructive role in the building of an order of peaceful coexistence among all nations. In order to be credible and efficient at the same time, these two aspects, credibility and efficiency of diplomacy, it should embrace the idea of dialogical relations between cultures and civilizations on the basis of equality. There is no leading culture or civilization at the global level. If we would base our our policies on such an assumption, we would have a perpetual war. Sovereign equality of nations, which is a basic principle of the United Nations Charter, must include sovereign equality of cultures. Only this will allow the conduct of diplomatic relations on the basis of mutuality. Against this background, just a few positive aspects I would offer upon concluding. Against this background, initiatives of cultural diplomacy may help to create a climate that is conducive to the settlement of conflicts and disputes through negotiations. In certain situations, culture in the widest sense, including sports, may indeed be the icebreaker and pave the ground for further confidence-building measures. Just to give some examples, the ping-pong diplomacy, the famous ping-pong diplomacy of April 1971, that preceded or initiated, one might say, the thaw, indeed the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States and Communist China, culminating in the historical visit of President Nixon in Beijing in 1972, this is one of the most colorful examples. Other examples where culture played a constructive role in a conflictual environment are the joint hosting of the FIFA World Cup in the year 2002 by former enemies Japan and South Korea, or the series of philharmonic concerts in September 2010 of the Youth Symphony Orchestra of the Commonwealth of Independent States, including musicians from Armenia and Azerbaijan in the capitals of the two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, and with a direct flight of the ensemble from Baku to Yerevan, with the former culture ministers of both countries on board. And not to overlook, in a constellation where both South Caucasian countries were still technically at war over the unresolved Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. This multilateral initiative, though it was not followed up by bilateral measures or negotiations, is a particularly creative example how culture can build bridges or break political taboos in otherwise intractable situations. Will the philosophical ideal of culture as common denominator of the conditio humana, the human condition, stand the test of reality? Cultural diplomacy is indeed most effective when it is embedded in a wider policy of peace. And it's only incredible in such a context. At the same time, I would say cultural diplomacy reinforces such a policy. If it is used as a tool of ideological confrontation, indeed an element of war, culture is not only losing its creative force, but becoming devoid of any content, made sterile and useless in terms of the advancement of humanity. So one might say, while the instrumentalization of culture for interventionist policies can make the thesis of the clash of civilizations a self-fulfilling prophecy, the honest pursuit of cultural diplomacy means the renunciation of any form of cultural exceptionalism. It paves the ground for a dialogue, a global dialogue of civilizations as foundation of peace, a peace that eventually will be more durable than an order of interstate relations that is the result of an always fragile and constantly fluctuating balance of power. Thank you for your attention.